In the Battle of the Temple Wood, our battalion had killed 136 Japanese. We had lost 7 dead ourselves and 43 wounded. Among our dead were the leader of 9 Section, Corporal Titch Little, a wiry West Cumbrian who'd been my own mucker, or mate, and Lieutenant Gale, our platoon commander. Little had been killed by a sniper when we first advanced toward the wood. Gale had been shot dead almost at my elbow inside the wood itself. 4 other men from 9 Section had been wounded, and when we withdrew and dug in for the night, the section was at about half strength. The purpose of the Temple Wood action had been to break up a Japanese concentration preparing to counter-attack the strategic strongpoint of Mektilla in central Burma, in which our division, the 17th Indian, had been cut off for 3 weeks. I'd only a rough idea when we made the attack of why we were doing it. Only now, after reading official histories of the campaign, do I understand the overall plan of which the attack was a small part. But then, at private soldier level, you frequently have no idea where you are, or precisely how you got there, let alone why. The trouble with eyewitness is that it sees only part of the whole. If my recollection of the Temple Wood action is patchy, I can only excuse it on the ground that I had never been in a fight to the death before, with the enemy at close quarters, which is, to say the least, confusing. Some things remain crystal clear. Fixing bayonets in the hot sunshine before our first advance, the moment when we were caught in the open by rifle and machine-gun fire, which took out 1/3 of the section in a matter of seconds, the chilling realization that the section's Bren gun was lying unattended, with shots kicking up the dust around it, and that as the man who seemed to be lying nearest, I ought to be taking charge of it, the hectic murderous confusion of bunker clearing when Gale went down, feeding grenades into a bunker and letting fly at a Jap running across my front with a sword, and finally withdrawing from the wood after 4 hours, which seemed to me to have passed in minutes, and seeing the man next to me dropping suddenly to his knees, shouting, "Look what I've got!" I didn't identify the object, but what he did get a second later was a bullet in the leg from an unseen Jap. I've tried to describe in plain terms what I saw and can be sure of. What I thought at the time is less clear, but some strong impressions remain. At the moment of fixing bayonets, I had that hollow feeling which most writers locate in the stomach, but in my case manifests itself in the throat. After we were fired on, I didn't notice it. To say I was shocked at seeing Steele and Parker hit is correct in the sense that one is shocked by running into a brick wall. Astonishment and fascination come into it too. You read of such things, now you see the reality and think, so that's what it looks like. The thought of being hit myself occurred only in the moment before I started crawling toward the Bren, to be submerged in relief when Stanley took possession. Going into the wood, I was scared stiff, but not witless. Given Aladdin's lamp, I'd have been in Bermuda. No, that's not true. If it were, I'd have kept out of the army in the first place. Being there with the choice made, you go ahead. And if anyone says you could always change your mind and run away, he's wrong. You can't. It sounds pompous to say it's a matter of honour, but that's what it comes down to, and Falstaff knew it. He was quite right, though, that honour hath no skill in surgery, which is why you are perfectly entitled to be scared. There is the consolation that once the shooting starts, the higher thought takes a back seat. Putting a grenade into a bunker had the satisfaction of doing grievous bodily harm to an enemy for whom I felt real hatred, and still do. Seeing Gale killed shocked me as our first casualties had done, and I think enraged me. I wanted a Jap then, mostly for my own animal pride, no doubt, but seeing Gale go down sparked something which I felt in the instant when I hung on my aim at the Jap with the sword, because I wanted to be sure. The joy of hitting him was the strongest emotion I felt that day. Incidentally, strictly speaking, I should probably have held my fire, since he was between me and comrades who were advancing into the wood, but I have learned since that I was not alone in letting fly at him and breaching what battle school instructors call fire discipline. I can only plead the heat of the moment and say that it seemed a good idea at the time. Perhaps I'm too self-analytical, but I'm trying to be honest. It's hard to say where fear and excitement meet, or which predominates. The best way I can sum up my emotions in that wood is to say that a continuous nervous excitement was shot through with occasional flashes of rage, terror, elation, relief, and amazement. So far as I've seen, most men are like that, by and large, although there are exceptions. A few really enjoy it, I've seen them, and I won't say they're deranged, because even the most balanced man has moments of satisfaction in battle which are indistinguishable from enjoyment, short-lived though they may be. Some are blessed with the quick reflexes which, combined with experience, enable them to keep cool, like the little sergeant with whom I bombed the bunker and who kept us steady when we were withdrawing. Others seem to be on a high, like the man who cried, "Look what I've got!" I was glad to come out of it, but even then I felt what I feel now, and what every old soldier feels, a gratitude for having been there, and an abiding admiration amounting to awe for the sheer ability of my comrades. Nowadays the highest praise a soldier can get is the word professional. 14th Army weren't professionals. They were experts. The aftermath was as interesting as the battle. Fiction and the cinema have led us to expect certain reactions from men in war, and the conventions of both demand displays of emotion, or a restraint which is itself highly emotional. I don't know what 9 Section felt, but whatever it was didn't show. They expressed no grief or anger or obvious relief, or indeed any emotion at all. They betrayed no symptoms of shock or disturbance, nor were they nervous or short-tempered. If they were quieter than usual that evening, well, they were dog-tired. Discussion of the day's events was limited to a brief reference to Gale's death and to the prospects of the wounded. Steele had been flown out on a flying taxi, one of the tiny fragile monoplanes to which stretchers were strapped. It was thought his wound was serious. And it was. I visited him after the war, when he had had to give up his job as a builder because his right arm could not be fully lifted and he could not mount scaffolding in safety. Parker was said to be in dock in Mactilla, and a few weeks later there were to be ironic congratulations when he returned to the section with a romantic star-shaped scar high on his chest. Penicillin was a new marvel then. Not a word was said about Titch Little, but a most remarkable thing happened, and I saw it repeated later in the campaign, which I have never heard of elsewhere in fact or fiction, although I suspect it is as old as war. Titch's military effects and equipment, not of course his private possessions or any of his clothing, were placed on a ground sheet, and it was understood that anyone in the section could take what he wished. Grandars took one of his mess tins, Forster his housewife, making sure it contained only army issue and nothing personal. Nixon, after long deliberation, took his rifle, an old Lee Enfield shod in very pale wood, which surprised me, for it seemed it might make its bearer uncomfortably conspicuous. I took his piala, which was of superior enamel, unlike the usual chipped drinking mugs. Each article was substituted on the ground sheet with our own possessions, my old piala, Forster's housewife, and so on, and it was bundled up for delivery to the quartermaster. I think everyone from the original section took something. It was done without formality, and at first I was rather shocked, supposing that it was a coldly practical, almost ghoulish proceeding, people exchanging an inferior article for a better one, nothing more, and indeed that was the pretext. Nick worked the bolts, squinted along the sights, hefted the rifle, and even looked in its butt-trap before nodding approval. Grandars tossed his old mess tin onto the ground sheet with a mutter about the bugger's handle being loose. But of course it had another purpose. Without a word said, everyone was taking a memento of Titch. An outsider might have thought, mistakenly, that the section was unmoved by the deaths of Gale and Little. There was no outward show of sorrow, no reminiscences or eulogies, no Hollywood heart-searching or phony philosophy. Forster asked, "Where's on first stag?" meaning on guard. Grandar said, "Not me, any rods, as about knackered," and rolled up in his blanket. Nick cleaned Titch's rifle. I washed and dried his piala. The new corporal, who earlier in the day had earned the military medal, told off the stag roster. We went to sleep, and that was that. It was not callousness or indifference or lack of feeling for two comrades who had been alive that morning and were now names for the war memorial. It was just that there was nothing to be said. It was part of war. Men died, more would die. That was past, and what mattered now was the business in hand. Those who lived would get on with it. Whatever sorrow was felt, there was no point in talking or brooding about it, much less in making, for form's sake, a parade of it. Better and healthier to forget it and look to tomorrow. The celebrated British stiff upper lip, the resolve to conceal emotion which is not only embarrassing and useless, but harmful, is just plain common sense. But that was half a century ago. Things are different now, when the media seem to feel they have a duty to dwell on emotion, the more harrowing the better, and to encourage its indulgence. The cameras close on stricken families at funerals. Interviewers probe relentlessly to uncover grief, pain, fear and shock. No reticence or even decency in their eagerness to make the viewer's flesh creep. And the obscene intrusion is justified as caring and compassionate when it is the exact opposite. The pity is that the public shapes its behaviour to the media's demands. The bereaved feel obliged to weep and lament for the cameras and feel a flattering importance at their attention. Even young soldiers on the eve of action in the Gulf confessed, under a nauseating inquisition designed to uncover their fears, to being frightened. Of course they were frightened, just as we were, but no interviewer in our time was so shameless, cruel or unpatriotic as to badger us into admitting our human weakness for public consumption and thereby undermining public morale and our own. In such a climate, it is not to be wondered at that a general should agonize publicly about the fears and soul-searchings of command. Slim and Montgomery and MacArthur had them too, but they would rather have been shot than admit it. They knew the value of the stiff upper lip. The damage that fashionable attitudes reflected and created by television have done to the public spirit is incalculable. It has been weakened to the point where it is taken for granted that anyone who has suffered loss and hardship must be in need of counselling, that soldiers will suffer from post-battle traumatic stress and need psychiatric help. One wonders how Londoners survived the Blitz without the interference of unqualified jargon-mumbling counsellors, or how an overwhelming number of 1940s servicemen returned successfully to civilian life without benefit of brainwashing. Certainly a small minority needed help. War can leave terrible mental scars, but the numbers will increase and the scars enlarge in proportion to society's insistence on racing spectres which would be better left alone. Tell people they should feel something, and they'll not only feel it, they'll regard themselves as entitled and obliged to feel it. It's a long way from the Temple Wood to Sheffield, and not only in miles. I knew a young Liverpudlian who, following the Hillsborough disaster, stayed away from work because, he said, of the grief he felt for those supporters of his team who had died on the terraces. He didn't know them, he hadn't been there, but he was too distressed to work. Suppose Grand'Arse or the Battle of Britain pilots, with infinitely greater cause, had been too distressed to fight. One shouldn't be too hard on the young man. He'd been conditioned to believe that it was right, even proper, to indulge his emotions. He probably felt virtuous for having done so. Fortunately for the world, my generation didn't suffer from spiritual hypochondria, but then we couldn't afford it. By modern standards, I'm sure we, like the whole population who endured the war, were ripe for counselling, but we were lucky. There were no counsellors. I can regret, though, that there were no modern television journalists transported back in time to ask Grand'Arse, "How did you feel when you saw Corporal Little shot dead?" I would have liked to hear the reply.